Good evening. Today is August the 28th, 2021. I hope everybody is having a good day. I'm back in Corsicana after spending the last few days in Terrell, where I'm doing a uh, clinical pastoral education internship uh, with the chaplaincy department at Terrell State Hospital, and certainly enjoying this uh, what hopefully will be the next chapter of my life, a life that's been I've been very blessed and found the journey quite interesting. Problems along the way, but every life is full of problems. I want to talk tonight about remembering a prophetic journey 45 years later. I'm a fanatic for dates and anniversaries, and the year 1976 was a very important year in the world, a very important year in my life. The uh, major changes were brought to my life was a master's degree, a pastoral appointment, and an engagement, things that were going to bring changes. On May the 14th, 1976, I received my Master of Arts in Church State Studies from Baylor University after having spent a year in classwork and 2 years writing a thesis on the Nation of Islam. And at the time, I was living in Teague, Texas, where I was working for the Texas Department of Public Welfare, known as now as the Texas Department of Health and Human Services. I had joined the African Methodist Episcopal Church in 1975, spent a week in Austin, an annual conference, and was greatly disappointed at the end when I did not receive a pastoral appointment. At the time, Bishop John Hurst Adams was over Texas. He urged me to hang in there, and he assured me I would get something eventually. It was during the conference year 1975 to 1976, I did a lot of preaching in a lot of different AME churches in various parts of Texas. Among those that I preached at was at the Bethel AME Church in Corsicana, the church where I currently pastor. And I found that most of the AME ministers I met, with a few exceptions, were willing to open their pulpit to me. And in early August of 1976, I got an appointment with Bishop Adams. I went to see him at his office in Waco and brought him up to date on things as far as my preaching at the different churches and the response I'd gotten. And I said, I want to see what my chances are this time around. And he asked me, do you want a church? And I said, yes, I do. Okay, I'll give you a church. And he said he wasn't going to tell me where it was. That was fine. And since I was living in Teague in the Northeast Texas Conference, he said initially that I would be receiving an appointment in that conference. And so I met him there on August 27th, 1976 at Bradford Chapel AME Church in Bonham. When I got there, though, he informed me that one of the presiding elders in Dallas had asked for me on his district. And I asked, was it Hartwell? And he said, yes. The late Reverend T.R. Hartwell, a wonderful man, I had preached for him when he was pastor of Metropolitan Austin. And he arranged for me to get my first appointment. It was an AME pastor. And for that, I'll always be grateful. He passed away in the fall of 77. I was a pallbearer at his funeral and still have very fond memories of that man. But it would be the September 5th of 76 would be the Sunday that I would preach at Emmanuel for the very first time. And in the meantime, I was still living in Teague, and I had clients all over Freestone County. And they had a client one time who was in Fairfield Memorial Hospital. And I went to, as I often did back in those days before HIPAA, they could list all the patients' names and room numbers out there. They can't do that today. But if I found a patient whom I knew, and when I was there to visit my client, I would go see this other patient. And I saw the name Deborah Bass, who was a nurse at Fairview Manor Nursing Center. And I decided to pay Deborah a visit. We had several visits. And we started dating in October, got engaged in December, and got married in February. Deborah Bass became Deborah Uzzle, and by the grace of God, we've been together 44 years, and we're looking forward to 50 in 2027. But see, a lot of things were changing at the time. A lot of things were taking place. But I knew that I was called by God to preach, and the church of my choice was the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And I was ready to pastor. Little did I know that would be such a prophetic journey. August 27th is the birthday of former President Lyndon Baines Johnson, which is a state holiday. So I didn't have to take off work or ask anybody's permission to go anywhere that particular day. But I didn't realize how prophetic of the future it would be. I left my apartment in Teague, drove through Fairfield and Corsicana. Now, I had been to those towns plenty of times. Fairfield was just 10 miles away, the county seat of Freestone County. I had clients there. I went there to various events, and Corsicana, growing up in Waco, I'd known about Corsicana. My brother had lived there back in the 60s, so I'd been to Corsicana many times. I'd never been to Ennis, and I drove through Ennis for the first time. I'd never been to Kaufman. I drove up to Kaufman for the first time and stopped and bought some gas. Then I had the other towns I'd never been through, Terrell, Quinlan, uh, Greenville, and Wolf City. It was in Wolf City that I stopped to have breakfast at a cafe that no longer exists. And up until from 1976 to 2021, I didn't go to Wolf City at all. I made a number of visits there this year. And it's on the intersection of State Highway 34 and 11, 17 miles north of Greenville in north central Hunt County. It was settled in the late 1860s or early 1870s when Lemuel Pinckney Wolf built a mill near the banks of the Oyster Creek. For a brief time, area settlers called the community Wolf's Mill. By 1882, the year it received a post office, the name had become Wolf City. It was incorporated in 1887. The tracks of the Santa Fe Railroad reached the community, establishing it as the important shipping point for area farmers. One of the major streets in town is Santa Fe Street. And in the early 1880s, Wolf City had just over 200 residents and a dozen businesses. And according to the Handbook of Texas Online, in 2015, there were 1,436 residents. I'm not sure what the 2020 census shows. It's a very nice little town, though. Hasn't been in the news a whole lot, but it was in the news in the fall of 2020 when a black man named Jonathan Price was murdered. And the man arrested and indicted for the murder was a white police officer named Sean Lucas, no longer a police officer. And there's been He was held in jail in lieu of a $1 million bond that occurred on October 3rd, 2020. And a lot of controversy over that case. Jonathan Price and I have, I don't think I ever met him, but we have a number of mutual acquaintances. And his case has gotten quite a bit of publicity, not as much as George Floyd, however. Well, back in 1976, when I got through taking the road I got on the road after breakfast to go from Wolf City to Bonham. And this looks like, I'm not 100% sure, but it looks like the neighborhood I went through. I'll find out for sure someday. And one thing that stood out in my mind, so I was driving up there to get on the highway. A young woman came out of one house and walked across the street to another house. This woman was barefooted. I do not know if she lived in the house, if she was going from her house to someone else's house, to someone else's house to her house, or whether she didn't live there at all, was just visiting. And whatever happened since, I don't know anything about her. If she still lives in Wolf City today or not. If walking across the street that was a regular thing or just a one-time thing, or whether she went barefooted in grocery stores and other public places. As someone who's had a foot fetish since as long as I can remember, I've always paid attention to stuff like that, and just about every barefoot female I've ever seen, I remember. I didn't know it at the time, but August 27th is the feast day of St. Margaret the Barefooted, who lived from 1325 to 1395. Awesome lady. And yesterday I did a video about her, and I hope you'll look at it for additional information. But I didn't know the connection at the time. Do I think it's more than coincidental that this woman was walking across the street barefooted on the feast day of St. Margaret the Barefooted? Absolutely. And there was a reason for me to be in that place at that time. I believe strongly in providence. And over the years, as I have advanced in my study of theology and history and related fields, and with the advent of the internet, I see other people with interest like mine in various ways. There are a number of barefoot ladies who are in the ministry or who are involved in other things, who are writers, and who've been able to develop a theology of their faith and tie it in with their feet, which is something awesome. Perhaps I'll do a video about that later. There's so many things that's more than meets the eye, and you can go very deep into the study of a lot of things. Well, Since I've been in this program at Terrell State Hospital, by the way, we back up a minute. I was appointed to Emmanuel Dallas in September of 1976. Deborah and I got married in February of 77 and moved to Dallas the following month. I served 3 years as pastor of Emmanuel. Then I was appointed to Macedonia AME Church in Kaufman. The first Sunday I went there to preach, that was the second time I visited Kaufman. The first time was August 27, 1976. And we moved to Kaufman in August of 80. Ended up staying there 8 years. And we eventually moved back to Waco, my hometown, where I was teaching at Paul Quinn College, then located in Waco, and where I was working on my PhD at Baylor University. I put the pastoral ministry on hold while I was working on my doctorate, but after I graduated, I got back to it and pastored for 3 years on the Blooming Grove Maypearl Circuit, for 3 years at Forest Hill AME Church in Fort Worth, and for 14 years at Wayman Chapel AME Church in Ennis. Then on November 19th, 2016, I was appointed as pastor of Bethel AME Church in Corsicana. God willing, I hope to remain at Bethel. We've been here 5 years and hope to stay 5 more. And I'm scheduled to retire in 2026, and we plan to move back to Fairfield, my wife's hometown, making the coming full circle. And yesterday marked the 45th anniversary of my prophetic journey. I have the times I've been to Wolf City. I've had lunch with a friend of mine at El Arbol, which is a Mexican restaurant. And twice I've been to a meeting of Excelsior Lodge number 505, which is right next to the Mexican restaurant. Unfortunately, that cafe is no longer in existence. The only eating places they have is that Mexican restaurant and a donut shop down the street. I've been there once. The lodge now has pancake breakfast every second and fourth Saturday morning. I hope and pray I'll be able to make one of those soon. Haven't been able to make one yet. But anyway, and I want to make that trip again, the entire trip from Teague to Bonham. By the way, that weekend, I made reservations at the Holiday Inn in Denison and stayed that weekend, August 27th and 28th, and it was arranged for me to preach that Sunday morning at Quinn Chapel, AME Church in Denison. I went that afternoon to Durant, Oklahoma, just to see what was going on, long before Choctaw Casino was built. I have no interest in gambling anyway. But had a good, got back to see an old friend of mine, George Norris, who had been my sponsor when I joined DMLA in Waco as a teenager, was also my sponsor when I became a member of Waco Lodge number 92. I've been planning on going to see Brother Norris for some time, and I kept putting it off. This I thought was a golden opportunity. Went by his house, saw newspapers out there. He was not home, so I knew he had been in and out of the MKT Hospital, Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railroad, which he was a retiree. And that's the reason he had moved to Denison, was to be near the hospital. He had to be there so much. I was sad to learn that on August the 8th of 1976, he had passed away. And the next morning when I spoke at Quinn Chapel, one of the members came up to me afterward and told me he was an employee of the MKT hospital and he knew Brother Norris. And too bad I didn't get there while he was alive. After service, I went to a local restaurant to visit with a new friend, Reverend Dan Harris, who was a native of Denison, who grew up in Quinn Chapel, and who was pastoring two AME churches, East Texas, Gilmer and Dangerfield, on alternate Sundays, a circuit rider. One church met first and third Sunday, the other met second and fourth. But being a fifth Sunday, he wasn't preaching any of those places. So this was Sunday, August the 29th. Let me see. So I got back in the car, went back to Teague the same way I had come. I remember stopping at a cafe in Corsicana, and then I was back in Teague the following Thursday, if I remember correct. I went to the annual conference at Belleville, Texas, and Bishop Adams told me that Reverend Hartwell wanted to send me to Emmanuel AME Church. So I called him the next day, and we made an appointment to meet that Sunday morning, and he took me to Emmanuel and presented me to the congregation. This is your new pastor. Again, Dallas was not on the journey, but that ended up being part of the plan as well. But Kaufman, Ennis, and Corsicana, important places in my destiny. We have many goals and visions for things to be accomplished during the next 5 years. God willing, it will happen. And I know we got so much problems, challenges, and the coronavirus has made things difficult for everybody. But by the grace of God, we shall overcome. I wouldn't take nothing for my journey. God has brought us this far by faith. I know He will bring us the rest of the way. So that's remembering our prophetic journey 45 years ago. Everybody have a wonderful evening, and God bless.